I'm Dee Snider of Twisted Sister. Hold on to your horses, because we're about to enter Sleepy Hollow. It's the haunting grounds of the legendary Headless Horseman.
The hairs on the back of my neck went up, and I could feel a presence.
Where the rich come to die.
This mausoleum is definitely meant to impress.
And there's more to the art than meets the eye.
Grief, the name of the statue, will follow you for the rest of your life.
Sleepy Hollow is home to one of the spookiest stories of all time, Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It may be among the most famous haunted places in the world, but it also has some rockin' art. You've got early American sculpture along with the impressive graves of some of the most powerful businessmen of the 20th century. In this episode of Dead Art, we enter Sleepy Hollow country, where art and legend come head to head. The Headless Horseman lurked among these very graves, here in the old Dutch burying ground of Sleepy Hollow. It is one of the oldest cemeteries in America, and the actual setting for Washington Irving's famous short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. These haunted grounds lie on the Hudson River, only 25 miles north of New York City. Originally, this tiny village was called North Tarrytown, but in 1997, it was renamed Sleepy Hollow after Irving's legend.
He put it on the map, literally and figuratively.
As a result of its fame, over 45,000 people are interred in what is thought to be one of the most desirable places to be buried in the U.S. Many at rest here were the rich and famous, who chose magnificent art and architecture to accompany them in death. The lure of this place is undeniable and timeless.
Washington Irving, as a young teen, visited from his home in New York City, and he always remembered this territory.
In the early 1800s, when Irving was here, the area was settled mainly by Dutch farmers. It was a place of simplicity and seclusion.
I think he thought that the early Dutch settlers, at least around the Revolutionary time, were very superstitious people, and he thought it was a very novel place.
The crooked stones of the old Dutch churchyard would stay with him the longest. More than 20 years after his childhood visit, Irving called on these memories to write his classic tale. It's the story of a lanky schoolmaster, Ichabod Crane, who competes with tough guy Brom Bones for the hand of the wealthy Katrina Van Tassel. Bones, determined to scare off Crane, tells tales of the village ghost, a headless horseman who is said to be buried in the old Dutch churchyard.
The Headless Horseman was a soldier. By the legend, he had his head shot off by a cannonball. So he was buried without it, and every night at midnight he's supposed to get up.
Supposedly a mysterious horse appears alongside of his gravesite. He gets on it and goes off looking for his head.
Ichabod Crane dismisses the legend until one fateful ride home in the dark of night, when he has a terrifying encounter with the horseman himself.
The church is really, and the bridge that's no longer in existence, are major characters of the story.
Washington Irving's book was inspired, I believe, by his being in the church and out in the yard, meeting some of the characters which were actually people buried in the yard.
Real villagers were the muse for Brom Bones and Katrina Van Tassel.
There certainly is a magical quality and an imaginative quality about the legend. About every other person that comes up the road will say, "Oh, where is the Headless Horseman buried?"
You can just about pick up the open area of grass right over here, very bright sunlight right now. That is where he is supposed to be buried.
We suggest that you come around at midnight and maybe you'll see for yourself.
It's not just the spook factor that attracts people to this place. The Old Dutch burying ground actually holds some remarkable architecture from the past.
Very few cemeteries in the United States have a title as illustrious as this title, a National Historic Landmark. And the building is typical Dutch-style church. Built in 1685, they gathered the stones that you see. They collected Hudson River mud. They laid up the mortar, they put the stones in the mortar, and kept building.
The Old Dutch Church is the oldest church in New York State. But the history of the burying ground goes back even further.
The very oldest stones here in the graveyard are simple field stones, and they're simply used to mark the grave, so you won't dig into it by mistake.
What you see here is some of the earliest American sculpture, the sculpture of gravestones. This is old school.
This is called a soul effigy. It has a face between two wings, and it shows the soul headed for heaven. It's not meant to be a portrait. It's meant to be a generalized religious image.
And this is just the beginning of Sleepy Hollow's graveyard art. Right next door to these simple early carvings are some of the most ornate sculptures and remarkable examples of architecture. These impressive works of art lie just beyond the Old Dutch burying grounds in what's called Sleepy Hollow Cemetery.
Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is somewhere between 85 and 90 acres. We have about 45,000 people interred in the cemetery grounds.
Tributes to the dead make up an exquisite outdoor art gallery.
The Sleepy Hollow Cemetery offers a wide range of monuments of the Romantic era.
And you've got quite a variety. There's neoclassical, Egyptian Revival, Gothic, and even modern touches of Art Deco and Art Nouveau.
One of the most interesting ensembles in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is the Delavan Monument. General Daniel Delavan was an officer directly under George Washington in the Revolutionary War. And this was where there was a lookout post. On this ridge, you could see well to the south and well to the west, and you could tell that the British were coming. So it's no accident that the family chose this as their family resting place.
When Delavan died in 1839, he was buried with his wife and relatives under marble tablet stone. 5 marble statues were erected, Jesus and 4 angels.
Angels were the servants and messengers of God. One of them seems to hold the trumpet of the resurrection. Another one holds garlands to represent everlasting life. Marble came into fashion at the beginning of the 19th century when neoclassicism became all the rage. Within the century, it became evident that marble wasn't going to hold up very well. In this climate, it's a disaster. You can barely read the inscriptions on the tablet stones, and the statues are badly eroded.
More than 40 years after Delavan's death, a descendant decided to add something that would last, a towering 25-foot granite column.
On the top is definitely a symbolic figure, a figure of hope. That was carved by a sculptor named John Moffat, a fairly well-known sculptor of the latter part of the 19th century. It's a bit overbearing, this very tall column and this life-size figure of hope. And this is true of a lot of late 19th century monuments of the rich and famous. Nonetheless, it still has a lot of the charm of the Romantic period. This is the monument of Owen Jones, a successful businessman of the 19th century. And when he died, his family decided that he needed something rather unusual. So instead of the neoclassic monument, which was in fashion at that time, they picked something in the Gothic style, which was very uncommon. A lot of churches, but not many monuments. And it's built like a church, with buttresses and all sorts of Gothic ornament. It's a wonderful confection of Gothic and neoclassic imagery, with statues of Angel of the Resurrection on top. There's a St. John at one end and a mourning Magdalene at the other. And most important of all, a full-sized figure of the deceased himself, with his hand in his coat in the characteristic pose of a captain of industry. A couple of very unusual elements, because they themselves are not Gothic, are two round reliefs on either side of the figure, which are by the famous neoclassic sculptor Thorvaldsen, a Dane. They're called Night and Day, and they show the angels of death taking the souls of infants to heaven. The monument is really a Gothic church in miniature, and it certainly looks as romantic as anything. One of the most interesting monuments artistically is for John Hall. We don't know much about John Hall personally. He was a merchant, a man of some means, his family was. And when John Hall died in 1891, the style selected for his monument was very neoclassical. It was carved by one of the best-known sculptors in America, Augustus St. Gaudens, in the style we call Beaux-Arts classical. Angels are supposed to be kind of indeterminate in sex, but this angel is indisputably and triumphantly female. And she is, in fact, a Greek goddess, modeled on statues of Hera and Athena. This is a real work of art. It has a real presence to it.
The art here is only accentuated by the natural beauty of this cemetery.
Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is, in fact, typical of rural cemeteries that started springing up here and there between about 1830 and the Civil War. And they were supposed to be parks where you would walk around and look at the monuments and visit your kin. And they were to relieve the pressure on the old churchyards, which were filling up.
When the old Dutch burying ground reached its limits, it was Washington Irving who stepped in. In 1849, he returned to his childhood haunts to start the Tarrytown Cemetery.
He loved this place, his beloved Sleepy Hollow. He, in fact, purchased a plot just inside the cemetery grounds.
When Irving passed away in 1859, his funeral, like his story, was legendary. The whole village shut down as crowds lined streets for the procession. 6 years later, these Tarrytown burial grounds, now Irving's home and death, were renamed Sleepy Hollow Cemetery as a tribute to the father of fright.
My favorite grave in the cemetery is Washington Irving's. It's not fancy, it's not pretentious, it's not meant to impress, but it's part of a family group, and it's right on the edge of the old Dutch church that he loved. And he is really symbolic of this cemetery.
While Irving could scare you with his words, an enchanting figure may bewitch you.
I'm standing in front of a larger-than-life statue of what we here at Sleepy Hollow call the Bronze Lady. She was cast in about 1903, was commissioned by the widow of General Samuel Thomas, who rests in the nearby mausoleum. He was a general during the Civil War.
The statue was made by a sculptor, Andrew O'Connor, and the model was his supposed mistress.
The name of the statue is Grief. She is a woman grieving at the door of the mausoleum.
No one knows why the artist chose such a sad expression, but her mask of sorrow has inspired a ghostly mythology over the years. Some claim to have heard this statue weeping. Others say they've seen real tears run down her face. But the most bizarre story involves a haunting dare.
There is a rite of passage story about the Bronze Lady that has been circulating for 70 or 80 years. It concerns some things that you have to do to avoid tragedy in your life. Remember, the name of the statue is Grief. Well, the story goes that before you graduate from high school, you must sneak into Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at midnight, climb up in the Bronze Lady's lap, kiss her, then slap her face, jump down, kick her in the shins, and run over to the mausoleum and look in. Of course, it's so dark in there you can't see anything. Then pound 3 times on the door and run like crazy. Otherwise, grief will follow you for the rest of your life. I never did it, but then again, I did not grow up in Sleepy Hollow.
As superstitions pass from one generation to the next, this mournful figure continues to inspire fear and fascination. Another site that intrigues is one that has seen many of Sleepy Hollow's dead over the years.
This is the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery receiving tomb. It was built about 100 years ago for the purpose of storing bodies in the dead of winter when the ground was frozen to 12 or 18 inches deep. So they would store them in here until the springtime came along and they could dig. Today, we do not use it anymore, but we do use backhoes and jackhammers, and we bury bodies as they come in. This building is actually a half underground. In the 1800s and early 1900s, that's the way they built mausoleums. The superstructure is out of brick. The floor and the ceilings are massive blocks of slate. We have 42 crypts, and I can imagine that many, many years ago, when the winters were long and cold, they had all 42 filled and probably had caskets stacked on the floor. It must have been a terrible time for a grave digger, but that's the way they had to do it. These little skulls were put in there by a certain board member of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery who gives tours here, and they kind of delight or scare the people on the tours. Sometimes I say those are just some of my high school buddies.
In 1970, this receiving tomb even delighted moviegoers on the big screen when it was used as a set for the vampire film House of Dark Shadows. The empty crypts of this unsettling tomb only add to Sleepy Hollow's reputation of mystery and intrigue. But the real draw of the region is its beauty and tranquility. In the late 1800s, many of New York's rich and powerful made Sleepy Hollow and the surrounding area their summer retreat.
You had such people as Jay Gould and Cyrus Field and John D. Rockefeller.
A lot of the former farms were bought up and combined and assembled into big estates. And people particularly liked the hilltops for their houses with their domains stretched out around them.
Many of these wealthy barons chose to stay here in death, building tombs almost as grand as their summer estates.
This is the mausoleum of William Rockefeller, the brother of John D. Rockefeller and a high executive in the Standard Oil Company. And when he died in 1920, his family bought this oversized plot on one of the highest points in the cemetery and erected this large Roman-style mausoleum, blown up to heroic scale. One of the main features of this mausoleum is the row of columns that go all the way around the building. They are known as Ionic. That's one of the standard styles of classical Greek architecture. The relief over the door, the standing figures bidding farewell, is said to have been carved by Gaston Lachaise, who is a well-known modernist sculptor. This is a version of the kind of low relief that was used on Greek gravestones. This mausoleum is definitely meant to impress. It's massive, rather intimidating. It was meant to show that this was a very wealthy and important person.
Rockefeller is not the only bigwig who purchased high-end real estate on this ridge. His neighbor, in fact, is an old buddy and colleague.
This is the mausoleum of another big oil man, John Archbold, who was the head of Standard Oil of New Jersey. After his death, his family erected this very different style of mausoleum. Its most prominent feature is its round dome. This is a mixture of styles, but basically this is Byzantine. It's based on models in Constantinople. One of the Greek features of the mausoleum are the crosses used as decoration. As opposed to the Christian cross, the Byzantine cross often has arms of equal or near equal length. Some of the ornamentation is symbolic. The peacock is, in some traditions, a symbol of immortality. Over the door, the mosaic contains the Alpha and Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, which are symbols of Christ and of immortality and of eternity. This is very different from the neoclassical mausoleum of William Rockefeller. Nevertheless, it's one of the most imposing monuments here in the whole cemetery.
Not all the graves of the rich and famous here are grand and commanding. Some have a more simple and personal touch.
This is the resting place of a very famous person, Andrew Carnegie. He was, in his time, one of the wealthiest men on the face of the earth. He was an industrialist. His business was steel. Carnegie was a philanthropist extraordinaire. He gave, so it is said, 90% of his wealth away. The landscape designer of this plot was Frederick Law Olmsted, who was famous in his own right for participating in designing Central Park in New York City. This beautiful Celtic cross is made from granite that was quarried from Skibo, Scotland. Carnegie was born into poverty in Scotland. Perhaps he chose this unostentatious spot for a burial place because he remembered his roots, that he was not always wealthy.
Carnegie and Rockefeller are the headliners, but there are plenty of other famous and influential people around. You've got cosmetics queen Elizabeth Arden, IBM founder Thomas Watson, and auto giant Walter Chrysler. While displays of wealth and beauty are around every corner, what you don't see are the hidden secrets and dark scandals behind many of these graves.
Anne Lohman is a very interesting character. She was a controversial New York abortionist in the early to mid-1800s and was known as Madame Restel. She was a well-known and shunned person. In fact, she went to prison and served a year. The charge was child murder. Toward the end of her life, she was being tried again for the same offense. The morning of her trial, a servant in her house found her in the bathtub. She had slit her throat from ear to ear. Her monument contains an opening where there is a marble replica of a baby. This baby represented the likeness of her little granddaughter that had died.
From secret stories of suicide to displays of vision and success, The graveyards of this tiny village have it all. But it's Washington Irving's ghostly legend that inspires people's fascination and fear again and again.
People who are psychics or have a passion for the supernatural ask me, did you ever see a ghost? My answer is always, no, I have not seen these things. Do I keep an open mind? Yes. One lady told me that as she was sitting in the old Dutch burying ground, that her German Shepherd dog started growling at something, and there was nothing there, but this lady said the hairs on the back of my neck went up and I could feel a presence with me. What that presence was, I don't know.
The story of the Headless Horseman is firmly rooted in these grounds and will continue to spark the imagination of generations to come. Sleepy Hollow is packed with history as well as first-class art and architecture. And where else can you walk among tombstones that inspired one of America's most famously spooky short stories? For a real thrill, visit around midnight, and you may have a run-in with the Headless Horseman.